All right, we're ready for Isaiah chapters 28 to 32 in our survey through Isaiah. This is the outline we're following. Two major sections to the book. We're still in the first of those, which carries us through chapter 39. We have, looking at subsections, we have given attention to the prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem. And then we focused on the prophecy against the nations. And then last time we talked about the world judgment and deliverance of God's people. That section in 24 to 27 is somewhat of a summary of the nations section. And so now we're ready to shift gears even again and go back to the principle we saw in chapters 1 to 12. This has to do with woes against the sins of the people. We're going through chapter 32. This section goes on through 35. So we'll still be in it next time. But tonight we're looking at a series of five woes that are found here in this context in 28 to 32. So to get an overview of where we're going, I just call this whole section the woes. And again, it's dealing with the sins of the people, and it's focusing on the sin primarily of Judah, though some references made to Israel, the northern kingdom, primarily is focusing on the sins of Judah. And so we're getting the same message, basically, we saw in the first 12 chapters. Now, we're going to go through the same kind of cycle we went through in earlier chapters. And by that cycle, so get ready for this if you haven't already read ahead and seen this. You're going to go through a cycle where he'll talk about the present corruption, and then he'll shift to the future glory in the Messiah, or under the Messiah, and then come back to the present. And then he goes back to the Messiah, and then comes back to the present, then goes back to the Messiah. So you're going to have that jumping back and forth. And as we've pointed out several times, it's like the prophet paints this background, a dark background on his canvas, and then out of that background, that dark sin background, grows a brighter future. And so he paints a brighter future against that dark background, and he does that time and again. So to get ahead of ourselves for the handout, that if you're following it, you don't have to. That's just to help you listen a little bit. The last thing on the bottom of the second page is list the Messianic sections. We'll have that every time wherein there are Messianic sections. You should see 5 tonight. So watch for those 5. There should be 5 sections that deal with the Messiah. And so watch for those, and I'll call those to your attention as we go along. So here's what we have in the 5 woes. We have the woe upon Ephraim and Judah. We have the woe upon Jerusalem for their blind formalism. We have the woe to those who think they can hide from God, and woe to a rebellious people, and woe to those that rely on horses and trust in chariots of Egypt. And so the primary focus again is on the woe against Jerusalem and the people of God, though Ephraim is dealt with here, and we'll get to that here at this very first chapter we're going to consider. So let's go to chapter 28 now. Chapter 28. Now, in chapter 28, there is a woe upon Ephraim and Judah. Ephraim is obviously the northern kingdom of Israel. You have a question about that. It is the northern kingdom of Israel. So the northern kingdom has yet to fall, and it will fall in 722, but it's yet to fall at the time of this being written, and it is under the Assyrian threat. And so is Judah under the Syrian threat. We'll talk about whether or not that's how significant that is in a moment. So let's notice in verses 1 to 6, Ephraim is dealt with first, then Jerusalem standing for Judah, the southern kingdom of God's people. So let's start with verses 1 to 6. Ephraim will be brought down because of her pride. So that's the first point. He mentions Ephraim. That is the woe to the crown, that is Samaria, the capital of pride. So notice pride would suggest a rebellious spirit, so they are rebels. We're going to see rebels in Judah in a moment. But the crown of pride, that is Samaria, is full of pride to the drunkards of Ephraim, which I take to be literally drunk, but that suggests that they're unconcerned. While the prophets are warning them of doom and destruction because of their idolatry and because of their sin, they're in a state of intoxication and drunk. And so here's their pride and their drunkenness showing they're rebelling and they are unconcerned. And so the prophets are not having much headway with them. Now notice that they're going to be swept away like a flood. Look at let's start at verse 2. Verse 2 says that the Lord has a mighty and strong one. Might make a marginal note, that's a reference to Assyria. God's going to deal with Ephraim, the northern kingdom, with a tool. We've talked about tools several times. Nations are nothing but tools in God's hand. And so that has to do with Assyria. Assyria is the tool God's going to use to bring Ephraim down. So he's going to do that, and he's going to bring them in like a tempest of hail and destroying storm and like a flood of mighty waters overflowing, and he'll bring them down to the earth with his hand. So God's going to bring Ephraim down using the tool of Assyria. Now God's going to take care of Assyria, but he hadn't told us that till, at least in tonight's lesson, till a little bit later. Again, we see their pride, verse 3, their drunkenness. Verse 4 and verse 1 also mentions the glorious beauty is a fading flower, which suggests that all the glory of Ephraim is now faded. So whatever glory they enjoyed, whatever significance they enjoyed, whatever greatness they enjoyed is fading and it's gone. It's like a fading flower that's dying out. And now beginning at verse 5, it just simply means there will be a remnant. In that day, the Lord of hosts will be for a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty to the remnant of his people. Might underline the word remnant. There always has been, there always will be a remnant. Make sure you're in it. But there's always been a remnant. And so here's the point in verses 5 and 6. There's still going to be a remnant. There'll be a remnant to come back. So here's the point to the overall picture of verses 1 to 6. Ephraim's going to be brought down because of her pride. Now he turns attention to Jerusalem now. And how do I know he talks about Jerusalem? Well, he mentions Jerusalem later on in the context. So beginning at verse 7, but they also suggests someone in addition to Ephraim, which has reference to Jerusalem, and we're going to see Jerusalem identified by name at verse 14. So I know he's talking about Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem has made a covenant with death that's going to fail. Now, let's talk about the covenant of death first. You have a question about that in your handout. Look at verse 15. They have said, we have made a covenant with death. They really thought their covenant was a covenant for life. But it ended up being a covenant with death. What is that covenant of death? It's mentioned later in the context concerning their covenant of death in verses 17 and 18. We'll come back to that a little bit later. It is a covenant, an alliance with Egypt, as we're going to see all through these chapters, particularly chapter 31. They've made an alliance with Egypt because of the threat of Assyria. Assyria is threatening Judah. And they're afraid of Judah. Instead of trusting in God, they're putting their confidence in the horses and the armies of Egypt. And so they make an alliance with Egypt. And they're thinking it's a covenant of life, but it ends up being a covenant of death. And so here is a covenant of death. In other words, they think they're going to escape. They think that they'll escape the threat of Assyria. We've got it figured out. We've got all things lined up. Egypt is going to defend us, and Egypt is our alliance, and everything's going to go well. So they have a covenant of death. And so that refers again to this alliance with Egypt. So through their pride, they end up falling. So let's see what he says about this. Let's go through 5 points. Through pride and wine, they have erred. Let's get 7 and 8. Through pride. They have erred through wine, through intoxicating drink. The priest and the prophet have erred through intoxicating drink. Look at verse 8. For all the tables are full of vomit and filthiness. In other words, this demonstrates God's disgust at them. That's not a pleasant picture. That's not table talk to talk about. The tables are full of vomit. But that's how God views them, and that's how things have become. They are intoxicated and they're full of pride, and because of that, Judah is going to fall just like Ephraim, that is, Israel is going to fall. Now pay close attention to 9 to 13. Here was the problem, and it always is the problem. Very parallel to our present day. They reject the word and knowledge of the word. They reject the word and the knowledge of the word. Now I have subdivided A, B, C, E, and D right here, and this is quite interesting. This is the people's complaint about the preaching of men like Isaiah, particularly Isaiah. And so they reject his message, and what are they saying about him? Whom will teach knowledge? Whom will he teach knowledge? And whom will he make to understand the message? Those just weaned from milk, or those just drawn from the breast? In other words, he's too simplistic. You ever hear that today? that the message is too simplistic. I was expecting something deeper. I was expecting something that was more grand. And that's just a simple message of hear, believe, and repent and confess and be baptized. Too simplistic. There's more to it than that, surely. Well, that's what they thought about Isaiah. Who's he going to teach this to? To the babies that have just been weaned? I mean, who does he think we are? He's going to try to instruct the priest and the prophets. Now, verse 10, they view him as being legalistic. That's probably an oversimplification. But notice at verse 10, for precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. What on earth is that about? It seems that their contention against Isaiah is, he comes at us with all of these precepts. He comes at us with all of these requirements. He comes at us with all of these regulations, and he's too legalistic. A couple of quotations here. The pulpit commentary suggests at this point that the objectors profess to find in the prophet's teaching nothing grand, nothing broad, no enunciation of great leading principles, but a perpetual drizzling rain of petty maxims and rules and crampings and confinings, especially unsuitable to men who have been trained the training of priests and prophets, and who could have appreciated a grand theory or a new religious standpoint, but were simply revolted at a teaching which seemed to be so narrow and childish and wearisome. In other words, he just wears us out, drip, 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 drip of command after command after command after command after command. And we get tired of that. Leupold says they were amused at the fact that he seems to treat them like simpletons. It's here a little and there a little. He's teaching us a little here and then teaches us a little there. He teaches us a command here and a command there. He treats us like we're idiots. He treats us like we're simpletons. We don't like what he says. Edward J. Young says his laws were like little petty annoyances. One command after another, one joined to another, coming constantly. He just comes at us constantly. They're just annoying commands he gives us. Ever hear anyone say it's too negative? There's just too many thou shalt nots. Too confining. That's what they said about Isaiah. They didn't like it. Then in verse 11, he said, therefore the Assyrians are going to take them away. That's the point, that with stammering lips and another tongue, he will speak to this people. They're going to a people of another tongue. The Assyrians are going to take them away. Now at verse 13 and 14, verse 13, their pride led them to this apostasy. Look at verse 13. Here again we have this concept, but the word of the Lord was to them precept upon precept, line upon line, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and caught. They didn't have any use for the word. So here's the bigger picture I want you to see. That Jerusalem's going to fall. They erred through wine, but they rejected the word. Now let's go to verse 14 and 15. The rulers scorned the word and boasted of their covenant with death. In other words, Isaiah comes and says you need to trust in the Lord and not in other nations. And look at verse 14. Because we have said we've made a covenant with death. Now, they may not have called it a covenant of death, but because we've made our agreement with Egypt, we're okay. Forget you, Isaiah. Forget you. And they make light of the warning. Look at verse 15, last half of verse 15. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us. And for we have made our lies our refuge, and under falsehoods we have hidden ourselves. No, they're not actually saying we believed in lies, but in essence that's what Isaiah says they have believed in. They make light of the warnings of danger of putting trust and confidence in other nations. And they ridicule that and they scorn that. Now let's go to verse 16 and 17. The present insecurity is compared to future security. Here's where he's painted this dark background and he's ready to talk about something messianic. So here's your first of the 5 messianic references. So mark verse 16 and 17 right here as messianic. Behold, I lay in Zion a stone for foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone. And I'm not reading every word in interest of time, so I'm doing this on purpose. But whoever believes will not act hastily. Drop down to verse 18. Your covenant with death will be annulled. Well, I'm going to wait about verse 18. I'm going to go back to verse 17. The hail will be swept away. In other words, what I saw in 16 and 17, there are several phrases that describe future security in contrast to the present insecurity. This is what the prophet does constantly. He takes the present circumstance and contrasts that to the future under the Messiah. And then he's going to come back to the present. That's the nature and the style of his writing. Now let's go to verse 18 through 20. This covenant with death is useless and it's going to utterly fail. So he said, your covenant with death will be annulled. You made a covenant, I'm going to annul it. Your agreement with Sheol will not stand. And so the overflowing scourge passes through, you will be trampled down. He said, you're not going to avoid the problems with that. Now notice how, and you've got a question on your handout for this. There are two things to watch for at verse 20. This covenant with death is like a bed too short and sheets that are too narrow. They're useless. So you crawl in bed, and no matter how tall you are, if it's about a foot too short where you can't stretch out, and you got a footboard and a headboard and you can't stretch out, that bed is useless. And you get ready to cover up, and you've got a sheet that's about 12 inches wide, or a cover that's about 12 inches wide, it's too narrow, it's useless. He said, your covenant with death, or covenant that you made with Egypt, is utterly useless. It's not going to do you any good. That's his point. Now look at verse 21. The Lord will rise up as at Mount Perazim, that is Philistia. Just like Philistia fell, so likewise you're going to face consequences. That God will bring, look at verse 21 now. At verse 21, that God will bring to pass his unusual act. You may have a translation that has the word foreign act. In fact, your footnote in the New King James will say foreign act. I think what he's saying, God's bringing in a foreign nation to accomplish his purpose, and God's going to do that. And look at verse 22. Now, therefore, do not be mockers. In other words, God's going to bring this about, and he's still dealing with this idea that the covenant with death is useless. When I get ready to bring in Assyria, Assyria's going to do their thing, and you're not going to stop them. Now, God's not going to wipe out Judah with Assyria. He's not going to do that. But they don't know that. They don't know that. All they know is Assyria is a threat, and Egypt's going to protect us. And he said, Egypt can't protect you. If I get ready to wipe you out, I'll wipe you out. If I get ready to punish you but not wipe you out, I'll punish you and not wipe you out. When I'll do what I want to do. And Egypt cannot stop that. Now, this is interesting here. 23 to 29, to finish this chapter, God's purpose and plans are illustrated with farming. God's purpose and plans are illustrated with farming. Now, give ear and hear the voice and listen to my speech. And so he talks about various aspects of farming. Various actions have a reason. And so without reading the details, the farmer plows, and then when he gets through plowing, he levels the ground. And when he gets through leveling the ground, he sows. Some of his seed he scatters, and some of it he puts in rows. And so you may, if you don't know anything about farming, you say, well, why did he level the ground after he plowed it? Why didn't he level it and then plow it? And why doesn't he scatter all of his seed or put it all in rows? There's a reason for everything. There's a reason he puts some in rows and the reason he scatters seed. If he's sowing wheat, he may scatter that. Or he's sowing grass or hay, he may be scattering it. But another crop, he may put it in rows. So there's a reason for everything. Now, and then there's harvesting when it comes. There's some that you grind, and then there's some that you thresh. That's his point that he's making. So his point is, God's plan has a purpose, and God knows what he's doing. Look at verse 29. Thus also comes from the Lord of hosts, who is wonderful in counsel and excellent in guidance. God knows what he's doing. That's the point. So you got a question on that on your handout. So what's the point concerning God's purpose and plans illustrated with farming? You stand back, and if you don't know anything about farming, you say, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I saw him one day just scattering seed, and the next day he put it out in rows. I don't believe he knows what he's doing. Yeah, he knows what he's doing. And some of it, his crop he brings in and he threshes, and some of it he grinds, and some of it he takes and puts up in the barn. He doesn't know what he knows what he's doing. And yet we question God. They were questioning God. That is he going to allow Syria to punish us? God knows what he's doing. If he stops Assyria, God knows what he's doing. And so we might look at Romans 11:34. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who's wise enough or smart enough to set in judgment on God and ask and advise God, I think you could have done this different. God knows what he's doing. Now, there are a number of ways that we might question God. It may be how to raise our family. It might be marriage. It might be how he wrote the Bible. I sometimes wonder, why did he write it in the style that he wrote it? And yet God knows what he's doing. Who am I to question God? Who are you to question God? Very practical thing to learn from chapter 28. All right, that's chapter 28 now. Woe upon Ephraim and Judah. Now then, let's go to chapter 29, the first 14 verses. In the first 14 verses here, we have woe upon Ariel, which is Jerusalem, for blind formalism. Now, let's talk about Ariel and why that might be the term that is used, or is the term that's used in this context. If you have the workbook or following the workbook, there's a footnote that the word name Ariel stands for Lion of God, or some suggest the Hearth of God. Delitzsch and Calvin Delitzsch's work on the book of Isaiah suggests that it more properly means the Hearth of God. Without reading the entire quotation, I just suggest to you that perhaps the purpose in using that term is to say that Jerusalem, the city where the altar of God resided, would be the hearth, the altar on which God's judgment would burn. And that may be the point. That may be why he's calling it Ariel instead of just Jerusalem. But they have a problem with blind formalism. So let's look at verses 1 to 8. Jerusalem's going to be punished, but they're going to be delivered. Now, if they listen to the prophet, they know that Assyria is not going to take them into captivity. If they'll just listen. They got to listen though. Because what the prophet is saying is Jerusalem's going to be punished. God will bring Jerusalem to the ground. Let's look at verses 1 to 4. Verses 1 to 4 says that it starts off with a city of festivities. Let feasts come around, yet I will distress Ariel, and there will be heaviness and sorrow. And I will, look at verse 3, lay siege against you as a mound. And at that verse 4, you will be brought down and you will speak out of the ground. God's going to bring them down so low they'll be speaking out of the dust. It's a figure, gives a picture. I'm going to bring you so low to the ground that when you speak, dust is going to fly because you're going to be speaking from the ground. I'm going to bring you down. Now, he's not taking them to captivity yet, but God's going to bring Jerusalem down to the ground. Now look at verses 5 to 8. This is the thing they did not know God had in mind. And that is that God would turn Assyria away. God's going to let Assyria come in and rattle their cage and shake them to their core. And then Assyria's going to leave them alone. God's got another nation in mind that's going to come to Jerusalem. Moreover, the multitude of your foes, this is Assyria, verse 5, shall be like fine dust, and the multitude of the terrible ones, that's Assyria. In other words, what he's going to do is God's going to allow Assyria to come in, and beginning at verse 5, and the enemy of Jerusalem, verse 5, is going to be blown away like chaff. I'm going to let Assyria come in, but I'm going to blow Syria away. I'm going to take care of Assyria before they destroy Jerusalem. Now, beginning at now look at verse 6. You will be punished by the Lord of hosts with thunder and earthquake and a great noise and a storm of the Tempters. In other words, Assyria is going to come in, and for lack of a better term, Assyria is going to shake you to the core and rattle your cage, scare you to death. I'm going to let them do that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to deliver Jerusalem. Now notice at verse 7, that at verse 7 he said, the multitude of the nations who fight against Ariel. Yes, right here, verse 7. I'd lost my place. Look at verse 7. That the deliverance is going to be like waking from a dream. That's the point I wanted you to see. That even all those who fight against her in her distresses shall be as a dream of the night vision. It's going to be like a dream from two standpoints, for Assyria and for Jerusalem. So what's the point? Well, Jerusalem is going to, when Assyria is gone and no longer is a threat, it's going to be like waking up from a bad dream. You ever wake up from a bad dream and think, whoo, I'm glad that's over. That wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. But for Assyria, it's going to be like one who's dreaming of food and wakes up and realizes it wasn't real. They thought they were going to get the taste of Jerusalem, and they didn't. They got there, but they didn't get to eat of the cake, so to speak. They didn't get it. And so they wake up from, it's a nightmare for both of them, and they both wake up from nightmares. And that's the point down through verse 8. So perhaps 2 Kings 17 would fit in right here. Now let's go to verses 9. The problem is that Jerusalem is blinded because of her formalism. They're blinded because of their formalism. Look at verse 9. Pause and wonder, blind yourselves and be blind. What's the point? They're blinded. They can't see. What's their problem? Their problem is formalism, hypocrisy. Look at verse 13. Inasmuch as the people draw nigh to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me. Remember that? Heard that before? You're probably familiar with it, not because you read Isaiah 29 constantly, but because of Jesus' quotation of that is where we're familiar with that. It's talking about hypocrisy. And their fear toward me, you might underline this phrase at verse 13, is taught by the commandment of men. The New American Standard, I think, may help us with that. It's a tradition learned by rote. That's in your workbook. The NET says it's nothing but a man-made ritual. In other words, their religion had turned into nothing but formalism, going through the form and through the motions and going through a ritual. Could we do that? Sure we could. We could be involved in a ritual of nothing but ritual and formalism. So they're blind, there's hypocrisy, and there's formalism, and judgment renders their wisdom as nothing. Look at verse 14. For wisdom, I'm reading at the middle of the verse, of their wise men will perish. Their wisdom comes to nothing. So in the first 14 verses, Jerusalem is given a woe. Why? Because you're blind, spiritually blind, and you're hypocrites, and you're going through formalism of worship. You're just going through the motions of some kind of worship. And so woe to Jerusalem. All right, now let's go to the rest of that chapter, 15 to 24. Woe to those who think they can hide from God. Now, what's the significance here of trying to hide from God? It seems that it's their alliance with Egypt. Let's put it in context now, because we've already seen that alliance with Egypt. We're going to see it again in chapter 31. That it's an alliance they've made with Egypt. Perhaps they think, nobody knows. We've gone over and secretly made our covenant over here. Nobody tell that we made this covenant with Egypt. God doesn't know. But God does know. So woe to those who seek deep to hide their counsel far from the Lord, as if God's not going to take notice of that. And their works are in the dark, and they say, who sees and who knows? Who knows about our covenant of death with Egypt? Who knows about all that? Well, then they're chided at verse 16. Shall the potter be esteemed as the clay, and shall the thing that is made say to him who made it, why did you make me? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are that you can advise God and you're acting like you're the potter and not the clay? You're nothing but a piece of clay is all you are. You think you can hide from God? Now, beginning at verse 17, here is your second Messianic section. And so there's brighter future under the Messiah. Now let's get this quickly, because we want to make chapters 30, 31, and 32. 31 and 32 are short, but 30 is kind of long, so we got to get 30 if we can. So here's what happens in this section on the Messiah. In the days of the Messiah, this is the brighter days ahead, there's going to be a change. Verses 17, 18, and 19. So what kind of change? Well, the deaf will be able to hear, and the blind will be able to see. That's enough to make the point. Now, that's not literally blind and literally deaf, but the people are blinded. They're not seeing. And yet, under the Messiah, those who are the servants of God will be clearly seeing. In other words, there's a change taking place. Contrasted to the present corruption of Isaiah's day. The second thing, verses 20 and 21, is the reason why. The reason why things are brighter is the enemy is cut off. Now notice there are three things that are mentioned here concerning the enemy being cut off. That is the three classes of people. Notice first of all, there is the terrible one, Assyria will be cut off, those who scorn, verse 14, and those who watch for an occasion to accuse God's people. Now, those are the enemies, and so they're cut off. So in the days of the Messiah, the enemy's gone. The enemy's cut off. So the threat, all of this threat of the day of Assyria being a threat, the enemy's cut off. And now the result is there's fear and understanding. There's not understanding in Isaiah's day. And so notice verse 24. In the verse 23, in the fear of the God of Israel, those who erred in spirit will come to an understanding, and those who murmured will learn doctrine. It'll be a time when people learn and they know the will of God. In other words, if you are in the kingdom, you're in it because you learned the will of God. You could be a part of Israel in the Old Testament and didn't know the will of God. But if you are in the kingdom, in the present day, you know the will of God. You've learned the will of God. So that's just brighter days under the Messiah. Part of that brighter future contrast that he's constantly doing all through the book. Now let's go to chapter 30. I said it's a long chapter, but we can make our way through it. Woe to a rebellious people. Woe to a rebellious people. I think he's focusing on the leaders. If you're looking at your workbook, you may take note of the fact that the woe is directed at the leaders who put their confidence in another nation. George Robinson calls these people the pro-Egyptian party, properly so. This may be about the timing of this probably is around 705. Harkrider suggests that probably the time is after the death of Sargon, 705, when Judah reached the decision to rebel against Assyria. Maybe so. We can't know for sure about that. So let's see what happens here. Judah has confidence in Egypt and not God. Now look at verses 1 to 5. They take counsel, but it's not of me, God said. And notice now that at verse 5, you walk down to Egypt, verse 2. In other words, they go down to Egypt to get their counsel and get their advice, but you're not seeking advice from me. Verse 5, they shall be ashamed of the people who could not benefit them. Why are they ashamed? Because their plan failed. You have a question about that in your handout. Why were they ashamed? Because their plan failed. That's why. So they're ashamed because of failure. So Judah has confidence in Egypt, but their plan failed. Now, verses 6 and 7 said they sent goods and riches down to Egypt. That's making this covenant with Egypt. So they sent riches down. Look at verse on the back of donkeys. And they thought that Egypt would help them, for the Egyptians shall help them in vain to no purpose. Therefore it shall be called Rahab hem Shebath. Now, if you want to argue with the pronunciation of that, have at it. I'm not sure about that. But be that as it may, what does that mean? It just simply means, Moffat translates that, dragon do nothing. The New Century Version says, Raboth, the do nothing. In other words, Egypt was called the do nothings. That's the point. You put your confidence in Egypt, and they're a bunch of do nothings because they didn't help you. And so you sent your goods to obtain favor. But look at verses 8 to 10 now. They rebelled at the word. Look at verse 10. This is a rebellious people, lying children who do not hear the law of the Lord. They just turn a deaf ear. I'm not listening to the law of the Lord. But what did they listen to? Here's something very practical. Look at verse 10. They said, do not see. That's prophesy. That's what the word see means. They say to the seer, the prophet, do not prophesy. In other words, don't tell us what the will of the Lord is, but speak unto us smooth things. We want to hear a positive message. We want to hear something uplifting. I want to be encouraged. We don't want to be told that we're going to destruction. We don't want to be told we're in sin. Speak unto us smooth things. Here's the problem. Here's why the woe. They rebel at the word. Now, verses 12 to 14, they're going to fall like a wall. In other words, the wall is going to topple. Look at like a bulge in a high wall. Look at verse 13. A wall that's going to fall and it's going to shatter like pottery. You're going to fall over and just burst like a wall. That's what's going to happen to Jerusalem. You're going to fall. So verses 15, 16, and 17 is a plea for repentance. Get this picture. That he said, in returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and confidence you'll have your strength. And you might underline the next phrase, but you would not. That's rebellion. That's stubbornness. You would not. If you'd have just returned, you'd have been fine. If you'd have just returned, you could have been saved. If you'd have returned, you could have saved your nation. But you would not. Powerful point. Now, verse 16 is a little irony. You put your trust and confidence in horses, you're going to ride off in horses eventually. I think that's part of the point. Now then, here's your next Messianic section, beginning at verse 18. The future will be different. The future is going to be different. Now, this is a Messianic section. That the Lord's going to be gracious and just, verses 18 and 19. The people will listen. Verse 22, they're going to renounce sin and they're going to be blessed. Now, let's get 20 to 22, and then we're going to leave that section. They will say, this is the word of the Lord, and we'll walk in it. That's not what they're doing in the day of Isaiah. So notice the contrast. I think there's a contrast section on page 2 of your handout. Then verse 22, they're going to renounce sin. They will cover your graven images. In other words, and they'll throw away their unclean things. They were not doing that in the day of Isaiah. So in the day of the Messiah, it's going to be much different. It's going to be much brighter future. Now God's going to deal with Assyria. And so you may be scratching your head if you were living in the day of Isaiah, what in the world is God doing using Assyria? Well, He's not done with Assyria. He's going to deal with Assyria. Look at verse 27. Look at verse 27. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from the altar, burning with His anger, and His burden is heavy. His indignation is coming. And so what's He talking about? He's talking about what God's going to do to Assyria. What God is going to bring down upon Assyria. That Syria is going to fall. So first of all, Assyria is going to fall, verse 27 and 28. Then look at verse 29. The fall is going to cause Israel to rejoice. Look at verse 31. For through the voice of the Lord, Assyria, here's Assyria. That's what I was hesitating a moment ago. I'm looking for where Assyria is. How do I know this is about Assyria, you may ask? Because Assyria is identified at verse 31, that Assyria was beaten down, who struck with a rod. So God's going to deal with Assyria. God's going to bring them down to the ground, and God's going to be done with them, and He'll take care of them. The Pyre of Fire is a pile of combustible that's to be burned, to burn a corpse at a funeral. God's going to make basically kindling out of Assyria and burn it just like He's burning a corpse, is what He's going to do. So God's going to deal with Assyria. So woe to rebellious people. You put the confidence in the wrong place, and you're going to fall because of that. Now, we grouped the last 2 chapters together. We've got about 5 minutes, and I think we can do this now. Look at verse, what we have here is woe to those who rely on horses and put their trust in chariots of Egypt. Chapter 31, only 9 verses. This is an important chapter. And I'll tell you why it's important. You should have marked verse 1. If you didn't, you may not have been here for the introductory. If you were, you've got it marked, and you may wonder, why did I mark this? I'm going to tell you why you marked it. Let's go on to verse 1. That is a summary verse, I'm convinced, of the book. In my mind, that summarizes the point of the book. If somebody said, tell me in one sentence what Isaiah is about, Isaiah 31:1, woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who put trust in chariots, for there are many, and in their horsemen because they're strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. That's the point of Isaiah. That's the point of the book. That's what he's driving at all through the book. So here is a summary of the entire book in chapter 31 and verse 1. Now, notice what he says here concerning it's foolish to put your trust in Egypt, and Egypt doesn't compare to God. Because, look at verse 3, the Egyptians are men and they're not God. The horses are flesh and not spirit. And Egypt and Ephraim and Judah ultimately is going to perish. God's going to deal with them all. So Egypt doesn't compare at all to God. Why would you trust in Egypt instead of trusting in God? Now then, God will defend Jerusalem and take Assyria away. That's the second time he's made that promise. And so what he says here is, look at verse 5. Like birds flying about, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. You might underline defend Jerusalem. I'm going to stop Assyria before they take you away. But verse 8, the Assyria shall fall by the sword and not of man. In other words, it's not because another nation, it's because I'm ready for them to go. When I'm done with Assyria, I'm done with Assyria. When this nation falls, it's not by the sword of man that it'll fall, it's by the will of God when it falls. When God's done, he's done. He was done with Assyria, and he's going to take care of Assyria. So God's going to take care of Assyria, but there was a plea at verse 6 for them to return. So chapter 31 is a powerful chapter, particularly verse 1. God's going, and so what if they'd listened to Isaiah, they would know that, okay, Assyria's coming, and that God's going to let them come to our door, but he's not going to let them in. God's going to turn them away. Now let's get chapter 32. A king reigns in righteousness. This is the next Messianic section. Verses 1 to 8 is the next Messianic section. And what we have here is a king reigning in righteousness. One thing I want to notice, he'll reign in righteousness, verse 1. The eyes will be able to see, and the ears will listen, and the heart, verse 4, will have understanding. But notice verses 5 and 6. Moral confusion is going to be gone. Moral confusion, chapter 5. Remember that? They call evil good and good evil. Remember that moral confusion? All right here. The foolish person will no longer be called generous, and the miser bountiful, and the foolish for the foolish person will speak foolishness, and the heart will work iniquity. In other words, that moral confusion where you're calling good evil and evil good, under the Messiah, those in the kingdom, that moral confusion is gone. That's the point. So it's brighter days in the kingdom. Aren't you glad you're in the kingdom? Aren't you glad you're living in the days of the Messiah, not in the days of Isaiah? Now let's get the last section, 32, 9 through 20. And here is the problem with complacency. The problem with complacency. That he says, rise up, you women who are at ease. Hear my voice, you complacent daughters. In the year and some days you will be troubled, you complacent women. In other words, they're indifferent. That's the idea of complacency. They are indifferent. They should be embarrassed. In fact, he says, strip yourselves, verse 11, and make yourselves bare. I think the point is they should be ashamed as if they were naked. It assumes that people who are stripped down, whether it's completely nude or partially disrobed down to some inner garment, ought to be ashamed, embarrassed. Those who are indifferent and are complacent ought to be as embarrassed as if they were naked. They are naked before God. The palaces have been forsaken. The cities are deserted. In other words, they are indeed, the vineyards are going to fall. It's the idea of just indifference. They don't care. They listen to the prophet and they turn a deaf ear. They don't care. I don't think he's singling out merely the women, but standing for the nation of Judah. Now, one last thing here is in verses 16 to 20. Here's your last of your Messianic sections. That should complete your list. So what we have here is a contrast to the day of peace in the Messiah. So again, you see how the writer takes this dark background, this complacency, this indifference, the people don't care, and there's peace and harmony and wonder and blessings in the day of the Messiah. So look at verse 17. The work of righteousness will be peace. And the effect of righteousness will be quietness and assurance forever. And my people will dwell in peaceful and secure dwellings, unlike the day of Isaiah. Well, that's a lot of ground to cover. Chapters 28 to 32. That's a lot of ground to cover, but here's what we saw right here is we saw these 5 woes: woe upon Ephraim and Judah, the woe upon Jerusalem for blind formalism, those who think they can hide their plans from God, and those who are rebellious people, and those who rely on horses and trust in chariots of Egypt instead of putting their trust and their confidence in God. Well, we may think this doesn't fit our day, but this well fits our day because those same sins are being multiplied time and again in our own day and time. Sometimes among those who claim to be the people of God. We'll stop there and we'll start with chapter 33 next time.